Snow fell endlessly over the Grand Duchy of, softening the sharp rooftops of noble estates and burying the crowded streets beneath layers of silver white. Lanterns glowed behind frosted windows while elegant carriages rolled through the capital carrying lords and ladies wrapped in velvet and fur. Music drifted from distant mansions every evening, warm and bright against the bitter wind. Yet beyond the glittering heart of the city, behind the towering palace kitchens, another world existed where servants huddled beside weak fires and prayed winter would spare them for one more night. Rose understood that world too well. At 22 years old, she carried wood, scrubbed marble floors, polished silver trays, and hauled icy water through corridors so cold they numbed her fingertips within minutes. Her father had died 3 winters earlier after drowning in debt owed to the crown. The creditors took their cottage immediately, leaving Rose with nowhere to go except the palace servants' quarters. Since then, survival had become a quiet routine of aching muscles, sleepless mornings, and empty stomachs hidden behind gentle smiles. Even now, as snowflakes clung to her worn brown cloak, she balanced a basket of bread outside the palace gates and handed half its contents to two shivering children curled beside a stone wall. "You should keep more for yourself," the older boy whispered. Rose smiled softly and tucked the remaining loaf into his arms. "If I eat everything alone, it never tastes good anyway." The children laughed weakly while she continued toward the palace kitchens, ignoring the hunger twisting inside her stomach. Kindness cost little when compared to loneliness. Rose had learned that after losing her family. Inside the servants' hall, steam rose from enormous pots while exhausted workers rushed between ovens and storage rooms. The head cook barked orders without pause. Someone had burned a tray of pheasant. Another servant slipped on melted snow near the back entrance. Every corner of the palace trembled with preparation for the grand winter banquet hosted by Duke Adrian himself. At the mention of his name, conversations always lowered. The young duke ruled with frightening precision despite being only 24 years old. Merchants feared disappointing him. Noblemen avoided provoking him. Servants straightened instantly whenever his footsteps echoed through the halls. Rumors claimed he had once dismissed an entire household staff because a single dinner arrived late. Others insisted he never smiled, never laughed, and never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. Rose had seen him only a few times from a distance, but each encounter left a strange impression upon her. Adrian carried himself like winter given human form. Tall, composed, and impossibly elegant, he moved through crowded rooms with detached calm while silver-eyed nobles competed endlessly for his attention. Yet despite his beauty and power, something hollow lingered around him, as though every wall within the palace existed to keep the world away. "Rose," the head cook shouted, "stop daydreaming and carry these trays upstairs." She hurried forward immediately, balancing polished silver dishes along her arms before following the line of servants toward the ballroom. The moment the towering doors opened, warmth and golden light flooded over her. Crystal chandeliers glittered above hundreds of nobles dressed in shimmering silk. Musicians played near the marble staircase while servants glided carefully between crowded tables carrying wine and roasted meats. For a brief moment, Rose simply stared. The ballroom looked like another universe entirely, untouched by hunger or grief. Then she saw him. Duke Adrian sat near the center of the hall beneath a black banner embroidered with the crest of. Candlelight flickered across his sharp features as laughed around him, desperate for attention he barely acknowledged. His dark uniform fit perfectly against his broad shoulders, and his expression remained unreadable despite the chaos surrounding him. Rose lowered her gaze quickly and continued walking. She told herself she admired him only because everyone else did. A powerful man commanding an enormous duchy naturally inspired fascination. Still, whenever she glimpsed him crossing the palace courtyard or standing beside snow-covered windows, her chest tightened in ways she could not explain. Perhaps she simply wanted to believe cold people could still possess hidden warmth. A servant rushed past her suddenly, bumping her shoulder hard enough to disrupt her balance. Rose stepped backward across melted snow scattered near the entrance. Her worn shoe slid instantly. The silver tray crashed onto the marble floor. Goblets shattered. Roasted pheasant scattered across the duke's table. The music stopped. Every noble in the ballroom turned toward her. Rose knelt immediately, her face burning with humiliation as shards of glass trembled beneath her shaking hands. Silence spread heavily across the hall. She could feel dozens of amused stares pressing against her bowed head. Then Adrian rose slowly from his chair. The room seemed to freeze around him. Rose forced herself to look upward and met his icy gray eyes for the first time. No anger burned there. Somehow his calmness felt far. He studied her torn sleeves, reddened hands, and frightened expression before speaking in a voice sharp enough to cut through the ballroom. "You're too ordinary to eat beside me," he said coldly, "let alone stand near me." Soft laughter rippled through the nobles. Rose felt something inside her crack quietly apart. She lowered her eyes before anyone could witness the tears gathering there. "Understood, Your Grace," she whispered. Her voice barely rose above the crackling fireplaces, yet the shame behind it lingered in the silence. Rose gathered the broken dishes with trembling fingers while servants avoided looking at her. When she finally escaped the ballroom, icy wind struck her face the moment she stepped outside. Snow swirled across the dark courtyard as though the palace wished to bury her humiliation beneath winter itself. Alone beside the servants' quarters, Rose pressed hands against her mouth and cried in years, devastated because the Duke's cruel words had wounded her far more deeply than hunger alone. Morning arrived beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds, and the palace awakened with its usual rhythm of commands, clattering dishes, and hurried footsteps. Rose returned to work before dawn despite the ache lingering in her chest from the banquet humiliation. She carried linens through narrow corridors with lowered eyes, avoiding polished mirrors that might remind her how she had felt beneath the laughter of nobles. The other servants whispered sympathetically when she passed, but pity only deepened her embarrassment. She wanted the memory buried and forgotten, even if the Duke's cruel words still echoed inside her mind. During the following days, Rose changed in ways even she failed to notice immediately. She no longer greeted exhausted workers with cheerful jokes while preparing breakfast trays. She stopped humming softly during evening chores. Whenever Duke Adrian crossed the palace halls, she quietly stepped aside without raising her eyes toward him. Her politeness remained flawless, yet every trace of warmth had vanished from her voice. It was not anger protecting her heart anymore, but caution. Admiring a man like Adrian had been foolish from the beginning. The change unsettled him more than he expected. At first, Adrian merely observed the difference. He noticed Rose bowing silently whenever he entered a room before disappearing through side corridors. He noticed she never looked directly at him anymore. Strangely, the absence of her smiles irritated him. The palace had always been cold and orderly, exactly as he preferred, yet now an uncomfortable silence followed him through familiar halls. One snowy morning, Adrian rode through the lower district to inspect winter supplies for the city guards. Frost covered the market stalls, and hungry citizens crowded beside bakeries searching for cheap bread. As his carriage approached the square, movement near the fountain caught his attention. Rose knelt beside a thin child wrapped in ragged cloth. The boy's lips trembled from cold while snow gathered across his tangled hair. Without hesitation, Rose removed the scarf from around her neck and wrapped it around the child before placing a small loaf of bread into his frozen hands. "You need this more than I do," she whispered gently. "But what about you?" the boy asked. Rose smiled despite the wind reddening her face. "I'll be all right." Adrian remained motionless inside the carriage as she walked away carrying nothing except an empty basket. Her steps looked unsteady against the thick snow, yet she never glanced back toward the child. The scene disturbed him in ways he could not explain. Most nobles donated food publicly for praise or political advantage. Rose possessed neither wealth nor influence, yet she gave away the little she had without hesitation. The image followed Adrian throughout the day. That evening he stood beside the library windows overlooking the courtyard below. Snowflakes drifted endlessly through darkness while servants crossed the grounds carrying firewood. Among them, Adrian recognized Rose immediately. Her shoulders appeared exhausted beneath the bundle she carried, but when an elderly maid stumbled nearby, Rose quickly stopped to help despite struggling herself. "Why?" Adrian murmured. No answer came. For years he had believed kindness existed only when people expected rewards in return. His father had ruled through fear and taught Adrian that affection weakened authority, compassion invited betrayal, distance ensured control. Those lessons had shaped every decision of his life until coldness became instinctive. Yet Rose contradicted everything he understood about human nature. Over the next week, Adrian found himself searching for her unconsciously. He noticed the careful patience she showed frightened kitchen servants during chaotic evenings. He noticed her reading poetry books beside the servants' staircase after midnight. Once, while passing the laundry hall, he overheard her singing to comfort a crying maid whose husband had fallen ill. The melody lingered in Adrian's thoughts long after he walked away. Rose sensed his attention eventually. Whenever she entered rooms and discovered the Duke watching her silently, nervousness tightened inside her chest. Adrian had not repeated his cruelty since the banquet, but his presence still unsettled her. Worse, she could not understand why his gaze seemed different now, less dismissive, more searching. One evening, he stopped her outside the palace chapel. "You work too much," he said. Rose stiffened in surprise. "I am only fulfilling my duties, Your Grace." "You look exhausted." "I am accustomed to it." Her answer carried no bitterness, only calm acceptance, and somehow that troubled him more than accusation would have. Adrian studied the redness around her hands where cold weather had cracked the skin. Before he could speak again, Rose bowed politely and continued down the corridor, leaving him standing alone beneath candlelight. Days later, a violent blizzard struck without warning. Snow hammered against palace windows while freezing wind roared through the courtyards. Most nobles remained inside their chambers beside fireplaces, but servants continued working through the storm. Rose spent hours carrying coal between storage sheds and kitchen furnaces because several workers had fallen sick from winter fever spreading through the lower quarters. By midnight, her vision blurred badly. Still, she forced herself onward through the snow-carrying basket of coal across the courtyard. Wind clawed through her thin cloak while dizziness weakened her legs with every step. She reached the palace stairs before collapsing suddenly onto the frozen ground. A nearby guard shouted for help. Adrian heard the commotion while reviewing documents inside his study. Irritated by the interruption, he strode into the corridor until frightened servants informed him that Rose had fainted outside during the storm. Before anyone realized his intention, Adrian pushed through the courtyard doors himself. Snow whipped around him. Rose lay unconscious against the icy stone steps, her face pale beneath scattered snowflakes. Without hesitation, Adrian removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her trembling body before lifting her into his arms. The guard stared in stunned silence. The Duke never touched servants. Yet Adrian carried Rose through the palace as though nothing else mattered beyond keeping her alive through the freezing night. When Rose opened her eyes the following morning, pale sunlight filtered through the curtains of the palace infirmary while the scent of burning cedar drifted from the fireplace nearby. For several quiet moments she remained still beneath heavy blankets, confused by the softness surrounding her. Then memory returned. The blizzard, the courtyard, darkness swallowing her senses beneath freezing wind. She tried to sit upright immediately, but dizziness forced her back against the pillows. "You should rest." Adrian's voice emerged from the chair beside her bed. Rose stared at him in disbelief. The Duke still wore yesterday's black uniform, though exhaustion shadowed his sharp features. An untouched cup of tea rested near his hand. "Your Grace," she whispered weakly, "you should not be here." Adrian looked away briefly before answering. "The physician said your fever was dangerous." "I am only a servant." "You nearly died." The words carried unfamiliar tension beneath their calmness. Rose lowered her eyes, uncertain how to respond. Silence settled between them while snow continued falling beyond the windows. Eventually, Adrian stood and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders with surprising gentleness. "You gave your lunch away again yesterday," he said quietly. Rose managed a faint smile. "The children needed it more than I did." Adrian's hand paused against the blanket. For years, he had surrounded himself with ambitious nobles whose kindness vanished whenever advantage disappeared. Yet this woman offered compassion even while starving herself. Watching her risk her health for strangers had unsettled him deeply. Guilt. He remembered her expression during the banquet humiliation and understood, perhaps for the first time, how carelessly his words wounded others. Rose noticed his silence and spoke softly. "You do not need to trouble yourself over me, Your Grace. I will recover soon." "That is not why I stayed." The admission escaped before Adrian could stop himself. Rose looked at him carefully then, confusion flickering across her tired face. Adrian suddenly felt exposed beneath her gaze. He turned toward the window before speaking again. "You should remain here until the physician allows you to work." "I cannot neglect my duties." That was not a request. Normally his cold authority ended every argument instantly, yet Rose only sighed and settled deeper beneath the blankets. Adrian realized he no longer wanted fear from her. He wanted honesty, warmth, perhaps even forgiveness. Over the next several days, Adrian visited the infirmary repeatedly despite whispers throughout the palace. Servants exchanged stunned glances whenever the Duke carried books into Rose's room or personally ensured fresh meals reached her bedside. Who once competed eagerly for his attention now found themselves ignored. Rose recovered slowly, though uncertainty grew inside her. Sometimes he asked questions about her childhood. Other times he sat silently beside the fire while she read borrowed novels aloud because he claimed the sound calmed the room. Beneath his distant exterior, Rose began noticing exhaustion hidden within him constantly, as though loneliness had followed Adrian for years without mercy. One snowy evening she gathered enough courage to ask, "Why are you being kind to me now?" Adrian remained quiet for several moments. Finally he answered, "Because I was cruel before." The honesty in his voice caught Rose off guard. "You are not cruel all the time," she admitted softly. His expression darkened slightly. "No, only when it matters most." Those words lingered painfully inside her long after he left the infirmary. When Rose eventually returned to work, she discovered the palace itself beginning to change. Additional coal arrived for servant quarters. Kitchen workers received proper winter gloves. Guards delivered warm soup to districts each evening under Adrian's direct orders. Though nobles praised the duke's generosity, many whispered suspiciously about the servant girl responsible for his transformation. Some maids accused her of seducing Adrian for wealth, mocked her appearance whenever she crossed the halls. Others warned that dukes never truly loved women beneath their station. Rose tried ignoring the cruelty, but fear slowly crept into her thoughts. The more Adrian approached her openly, the more dangerous her position became. Meanwhile, Adrian struggled against emotions he no longer understood. He found excuses to remain near Rose. Watching her smile at exhausted servants eased tensions he had carried for years. Hearing her footsteps outside his study distracted him from political disputes. Yet every growing feeling terrified him because affection required vulnerability, and vulnerability had destroyed everyone he once trusted. During the annual Snow Moon Festival, the palace transformed into a dazzling sea of candlelight and silver decorations. Music echoed across crowded halls while nobles danced. Rose intended to spend the evening quietly assisting kitchen staff, but shortly after sunset, Adrian appeared near the servants' entrance. "You are avoiding the celebration," he observed. "I do not belong there." Without another word, Adrian offered his hand. Rose stared at him nervously. "Your Grace, people will see." "Let them." His answer left no room for refusal. Adrian guided her through a smaller ballroom overlooking the snowy gardens where only distant music reached them. Moonlight reflected across frozen fountains outside the towering windows. For several quiet moments neither spoke. Then Adrian stepped closer and placed one hand against her waist. "Dance with me." Rose's heartbeat stumbled. They moved slowly across the empty floor while snow drifted outside. Adrian's touch remained gentle, almost cautious, as though afraid she might disappear if he held her too tightly. Rose realized then that the cold duke feared something far greater than political enemies. He feared losing the warmth she brought into his empty life. "You make this palace feel alive," Adrian confessed. Emotion tightened Rose's throat. Part of her longed to believe him, yet another part remembered laughter echoing through the banquet hall while he called her ordinary before everyone. She lowered her gaze, struggling against feelings she no longer trusted. Before either could speak again, voices approached outside the ballroom doors. Rose stepped away immediately, panic flickering across her expression while Adrian's eyes hardened toward the interruption waiting beyond the corridor. That night, the interruption waiting beyond the ballroom doors arrived sooner than Rose expected. By morning, whispers had spread across like smoke through dry wood, exchanged mocking smiles whenever she crossed the corridors, and several servants abruptly stopped speaking when she entered the kitchens. Someone had seen the Duke dancing privately with her during the Snow Moon Festival, and the story transformed with every retelling until Rose herself barely recognized it. According to the rumors, she had manipulated Adrian deliberately. Some claimed she intended to trap him into marriage. Others insisted she used tears and false innocence to gain influence over the palace. Rose endured the accusations silently while scrubbing silver trays beside the servants' hall. Every cruel whisper reminded her how fragile her place within truly remained. That afternoon, Lady Beatrice confronted her publicly near the palace staircase. Beatrice belonged to one of the wealthiest noble families in the duchy and had spent years pursuing Adrian's attention without success. Her elegant beauty and sharp tongue made servants fear her almost as much as the Duke himself. "You should remember your position," Beatrice said coldly, while several nobles lingered nearby to watch. "Men like the Duke entertain foolish attachments sometimes, but they never keep them." Rose lowered her eyes respectfully. "I have never asked anything from His Grace. Your existence beside him is already asking too much." The surrounding nobles laughed softly. Before Rose could respond, Adrian appeared at the far end of the corridor. Silence spread immediately as he approached. His expression darkened when he noticed Rose standing pale and motionless beside Beatrice. "What is happening here?" he asked sharply. Beatrice stepped forward gracefully. "We were only discussing the unfortunate rumors damaging your reputation, Your Grace." Adrian's gaze shifted toward Rose. For one critical moment, hesitation flickered across his face. He understood exactly what the nobles expected from him. A powerful duke could not openly defend a servant woman without inviting political chaos throughout the duchy. Every alliance surrounding depended upon noble approval. That brief silence shattered something inside Rose. She suddenly understood the truth she had tried desperately to ignore. Adrian cared for her privately, but the world around them would never permit equality between a duke and a servant. Sooner or later, duty would force him to choose power over affection. Rose bowed quietly before anyone could notice the pain in her expression. "Please excuse me, Your Grace." Then she walked away. Adrian watched her disappear down the corridor while unease tightened painfully inside his chest. He wanted to follow immediately, yet years of discipline rooted him in place. By the time he finally escaped the nobles surrounding him, Rose had already vanished into the servants' quarters. That evening she packed her belongings inside one small suitcase. The room looked emptier with every item removed from its shelves. A worn shawl inherited from her mother, two borrowed books from the palace library, the tiny wooden horse her father carved shortly before his death. Rose touched each object carefully while snow drifted beyond the frosted windows. An elderly baker from a neighboring town had recently offered her work and lodging after hearing about her kindness toward hungry children. At the time, Rose dismissed the idea because part of her still hoped could become home. Now she understood staying would only lead to deeper heartbreak. She loved Adrian. That truth hurt more than winter itself. No matter how gently he looked at her now, she could never forget standing humiliated before an entire ballroom while he called her ordinary. Worse, she feared the day he might regret loving someone beneath his station. Rose refused to become another burden chained to his reputation. Near midnight, she wrapped herself in a cloak, lifted her suitcase, and slipped quietly through the sleeping palace. Snowflakes spiraled through the dark courtyard while distant festival lanterns flickered across the gates. Rose paused only once beside the frozen fountain where Adrian had first asked her to dance. Then she continued walking. Inside his study, Adrian struggled unsuccessfully to focus on state documents scattered across his desk. Ever since the confrontation with Beatrice, unease had followed him relentlessly. Rose's wounded expression haunted him with unbearable clarity. For the first time in years, political expectations felt suffocating instead of necessary. A frantic knock interrupted his thoughts. One of the younger servants hurried inside, breathless from running. "Your Grace, Rose is leaving the palace." The words struck Adrian like physical force. He rose so quickly his chair crashed backward across the floor. Without bothering to retrieve his winter cloak, Adrian rushed through the corridors and into the storm outside. Snow whipped violently against his face as guards shouted behind him, but he ignored them completely. Fear drove him forward. Not fear of scandal or political disgrace. Fear of losing her forever. Near the palace gates, Adrian finally saw Rose walking alone through the falling snow. Lantern light illuminated her small figure against the endless white darkness. He called her name sharply. Rose froze. Slowly, she turned toward him. Adrian stopped several feet away, breathing hard from the desperate chase. Snow covered his dark hair and shoulders, yet he barely noticed the cold. The sight of her suitcase made panic tighten inside his chest. "You are leaving," he said quietly. "There is no reason for me to stay anymore." Her calm answer wounded him more deeply than anger could have. For a moment neither moved while snow drifted silently around them. Guards and servants watched nervously from the palace entrance, uncertain whether to approach. Adrian looked at Rose and realized power, wealth, and pride suddenly meant nothing beside the possibility of losing her. Then, before anyone could comprehend his intention, the feared Duke of slowly knelt in the snow before the woman he loved. His voice trembled for the first time in his life as he lifted his eyes toward Rose and whispered the words that would change both their futures forever beneath the sky.